Hi there, and welcome to week 4, the week we're talking about the actual digitization. So, all of these weeks we've been talking so far about the things that lead up to the digitization, which might be what you all thought you were getting when you signed up for this class was the digitize module. But all of that planning and working on obtaining permission and figuring out all of that ahead of this will make this part go much more smoothly for your projects. So, digitization procedures might be a pretty significant review for some of you. There's some of you who are either professional archivists who have done digitization work before, and for those of you, this might be quite a bit of a review. But hopefully, you can get some useful tidbits or maybe some updated information. The other thing I want to mention here is that if you have a format that has considerations that are not talked about in this week's lecture or the readings, reach out to me and let me know, and we can figure out some resources for you. We're going to talk a little bit about audiovisual digitization, not a ton. We're going to talk about digitization standards for sort of, what I would call standard objects. So, like, postcards, photographs, manuscripts, that kind of thing. But if you have a format that is beyond those couple of categories and you need some help figuring out digitization procedures, let me know. So that's what we're talking about this week, standards for both 2D items and AV digitization. And again, we're going to talk a tiny bit about audiovisual digitization, but I recommend following the links and looking through the toolkit for more. Um, and then we're going to talk about preferred file formats, scanner settings, so getting into the nitty gritty, scanners and equipment. We're going to touch on quality control and talk just a tiny bit about digitization workflows. So here's what we're talking about when we say digitization standards. And again, some of this might be review, some of it is new to some of you, so that's great. We're going to talk about each of these areas, primary versus access files, preferred file formats, and then the nuts and bolts of the scanner settings. The first important thing to know is the difference between primary and access files, or what used to be called master files, now called primary files, archival files, or preservation files. Um, the primary difference between primary files and access files is the digital size. So primary files are the big, super high quality images that you scan and keep on your or your organization's hard drive storage. The digital files that are usually so large that it's not feasible to share those with the public on your website or external facing database or for sending through email, they would take too long to load and take up too much website hosting space. But you can scan those items. You should scan your items at the highest quality possible and with no alterations as your digital original, quote unquote original. So then you save a copy of that big image into a much smaller compressed format like a JPEG. These smaller images are the ones that you offer to the public, and you can edit those smaller images as you wish, like color sharpening or other things, because you'll always have the big, high quality digital original to go back to. So, as we proceed in talking about file formats, keep in mind that we're talking about the difference between primary files and access files. Here's some of the most common file formats you'll encounter in a typical digitization project. Generally, you save your primary files as TIFFs and your access files as JPEGs or sometimes PDFs. We're not going to talk a ton today about audiovisual recordings, but if you see these file formats, you'll know what they're for. WAV files are generally the primary file format for audio recordings. MOV for video recordings are the primary file formats. I would recommend checking out the toolkit for links to documentation on how to handle audiovisual digitization and file formats. But the general idea is the same. Digitize at a very high quality version and then save a copy at a lower quality version for access, and then digitize to a set standard for each type of file. I want to say something here as we start talking about scanner specific settings, especially if you're doing your project for real, like in real life, or if you're taking this to a you know more than a hypothetical extent. Try out different scanner settings and see the differences for yourself. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about resolution here and a couple other things. Um, but for the most part, and I'll tell you the exception in just a second, for the most part, you're not gonna break the material, you're not gonna break the scanner. So check out what different resolutions, bit depths, and color profiles and settings do. Just try it out on your scanner. See what it looks like. How does a change that you make to the image look to your eye? And what difference does it make in digital file size? The exception to that is that sometimes, and you're going to read a section about this in the toolkit, especially for audiovisual recordings, sometimes you really only get one shot at digitizing something. Like the last time you play it is the time that you digitize it, and it might, especially with magnetic media, it may end up being destroyed when you play it that last time to digitize it. So if that's the case, I absolutely recommend being in touch with either a vendor, a local institution that has experience in AV recordings, working maybe with an AV archivist, that kind of thing. But for the most part, if you're talking about a photograph or a manuscript or something, try it out on the scanner, change up some settings and see what happens. So let's talk about resolution. Resolution is one of several settings that you'll customize in your scanner settings for two-dimensional items. In general, always, a higher resolution of pixels per inch makes a more detailed scan of your photograph to an extent, which is what we're talking about in this section. So here you can see a scanned photograph from Beloit College Archives here in Wisconsin. And keep an eye on this figure that we have circled in red here in the back. So that person that we are looking at circled here you can see the difference in 72 pixels per inch, which is pretty blurry, up to 300 pixels per inch, which looks a little bit better, and then 800 ppi, which looks much more clear. So that's great. That's the value of higher resolution. However, here you can see that the difference between 800 ppi all the way up to 2400 ppi is minuscule and barely noticeable. And for the quality difference, it might not be worth scanning something as high as 2400 ppi, especially considering the extra digital storage space that this would take up. So, with that in mind, choose a resolution based on what your project goals are, and do you really need to have it as high a resolution as possible, or does pretty good suffice? So in your scanner settings, which I'm gonna show you a screenshot of some scanner settings in just a second. What you do is aim for 3,000 to 4,000 pixels on the longest side of a photograph or whatever it is that you're scanning. And your scanning software will give you the option to set either the dimensions, height and length, which will set the PPI, or vice versa. You set the PPI and the dimensions respond accordingly. And again, I'll show you what this looks like. Um, a good rule of thumb is that if your original item has its longest side longer than 7 inches, set the PPI to 300. If the longest side is less than 7 inches, set the PPI to 600. And that's just a general rule of thumb best practice. Just to note that you might see PPI, or pixels per inch, used interchangeably with DPI, which means dots per inch. DPI originated with printed materials, and it still technically refers to a printed image resolution, but DPI sometimes gets used in scanner software as well. And if it's referring to a scanned image resolution, it means the same thing as PPI. The other thing to note is if you're talking about slides or negatives, because those originals are much, much smaller, you scan those at a much, much higher PPI. So 4,000 for 35 millimeter slides, or 2,000 for 4x5 negatives. I'm going to pause there and start another video in a second. See you over there.